The Appalachian Trail, a sprawling wilderness path stretching over 2,190 miles from Georgia to Maine, is often seen as a serene escape into nature. But for some, its shadowy forests, isolated mountains, and sheer vastness have been the setting for unimaginable horrors. One such story, whispered among hikers and locals, revolves around a man named Jeremy, whose experience on the trail remains one of the most disturbing accounts to date. Jeremy was a seasoned hiker, accustomed to the solitude and challenges of the trail. In the fall of 2011, he set out to conquer a particularly remote section of the Appalachian Trail in western North Carolina. The trail during autumn was beautiful yet eerie, with bare trees clawing at the sky and fog settling thick between the hills. Jeremy was no stranger to strange noises or the feeling of being watched. Those were part of the territory. But this trip felt different from the start. It began with small oddities. On his first night, as he lay in his tent beneath the dim glow of the moon, he heard faint whispers. At first, he thought they were the murmurs of a passing group of hikers, but when he unzipped his tent to look, the woods were still. The whispers continued, so faint he couldn't make out the words. Convinced it was just the wind or his imagination, he went back to sleep. The next day, Jeremy hiked through a dense forest section where the light barely penetrated the canopy. He found what he assumed was an abandoned campsite, an old tent collapsed and rotting with weather-beaten gear strewn around. Oddly, it seemed like the site had been hastily abandoned. A metal cup still held water, and a moldy sleeping bag lay half unzipped. A deep unease crept over him, but he pressed on, reasoning that it was likely just the leftovers of a panicked hiker who had faced an emergency. As night fell, Jeremy set up his own camp miles away from the abandoned one. He built a fire, cooked his food, and settled in for the night. Just as he began to drift off, he heard a soft rustling outside. He held his breath, straining his ears as the noise grew louder. It wasn't the wind. Something, or someone, was walking outside his tent. Gathering his courage, Jeremy unzipped the tent and shone his flashlight into the woods. The beam caught nothing but skeletal trees and the faint mist rising from the damp ground. Still, the rustling continued, now moving in a circle around his camp. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The following day brought no relief. Jeremy couldn't shake the feeling that he was being followed. Every so often, he thought he saw movement in the corner of his eye, shadows darting between the trees. Once he turned sharply, thinking he'd caught sight of a figure, but there was nothing, just silence. That night, everything escalated. Jeremy chose a more open spot for his camp, hoping to feel safer. But safety was an illusion. Around midnight, he awoke to the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and close. They stopped right outside his tent. Heart pounding, he reached for the small knife he kept in his gear. Before he could react further, his tent began to collapse in on him, as if someone was pulling it down from the outside. Panicking, Jeremy slashed at the tent fabric and stumbled out, expecting to face his tormentor. But again, there was no one there. Only the oppressive silence of the woods. His fire had gone out, and the darkness was so thick it felt alive. Grabbing his essentials, Jeremy fled into the night, running blindly down the trail with his flashlight barely illuminating the way. As dawn broke, he reached a ranger station. Disheveled and shaken, he recounted his experience to the ranger, who listened intently. When Jeremy mentioned the abandoned campsite, the ranger's face grew pale. He explained that several years earlier, a young couple had disappeared in that area. Their belongings were found at their campsite, but they were never seen again. Jeremy's account matched reports from other hikers who had ventured through the same section of the trail. Whispers in the night, the sense of being followed, and the unmistakable sound of footsteps were common themes. Some believed it was the spirits of the missing couple, others an unhinged hermit who prowled the area. But no one had ever seen the source of the disturbances. Jeremy never hiked the Appalachian Trail again. The experience left him haunted, plagued by nightmares of unseen figures and collapsing tents. To this day, hikers passing through that stretch speak in hushed tones about the eerie feeling of being watched and the strange noises that seem to come from nowhere. The Appalachian Trail may be a haven for adventurers, but it also holds secrets that remind us how little we truly understand about the wilderness and the darkness that dwells within it.
Story number 2.
The Appalachian Trail is not just a path through the wilderness, it's a journey into the unknown, a place where the natural beauty often masks a darker, more sinister reality. Beneath its serene exterior lies a history of strange disappearances, unexplainable encounters, and disturbing events. One of the most chilling stories involves a hiker named Emily, whose experience in 2014 still sends shivers down the spines of those who dare to tread that same stretch of trail in Virginia. Emily was a solo hiker, an experienced backpacker who thrived on solitude. She was tackling a week-long section of the trail, determined to soak in the peace of the wilderness. Her trip began smoothly. She encountered other hikers during the day and enjoyed the solitude of her campsites at night. By the third day, however, things began to feel off. That morning, as she packed up her camp, Emily noticed something peculiar, a series of strange symbols drawn in the dirt near her tent. They weren't random marks. These were deliberate patterns, vaguely resembling stick figures with circles for heads, all linked together by jagged lines. Thinking it was a prank by other hikers, she dismissed it and moved on, though she couldn't shake a feeling of unease. Later that day, as she hiked through a particularly remote stretch, she became aware of an unnatural silence. The usual forest sounds, bird calls, rustling leaves, distant animal cries, were absent. It was as if the woods were holding their breath. She also began to feel as though she was being watched. Every so often, she caught glimpses of movement in her peripheral vision. But when she turned to look, there was nothing there. As dusk approached, Emily hurried to set up camp. She found a small clearing off the trail and pitched her tent, trying to shake the unease that had followed her all day. That night, the quiet was oppressive, broken only by the occasional snap of a branch. At one point, she swore she heard faint laughter, a high-pitched childlike giggle, but it was distant and fleeting. She told herself it was just the wind playing tricks on her. She awoke in the middle of the night to the sound of her tent zipper being pulled. Frozen with fear, she held her breath, listening as the zipper slowly opened an inch before stopping. Summoning her courage, she grabbed her flashlight and knife and unzipped the tent in one swift motion. The beam of light revealed nothing but the dense forest and the swirling mist that clung to the ground. She didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, Emily decided to cut her trip short and head back to civilization. But as she packed up her gear, she discovered something that made her stomach drop. Another set of symbols, identical to the ones she'd found days earlier, etched into the dirt just outside her tent. This time, the figures were larger, more intricate, and appeared to encircle her campsite. Terrified, she practically ran down the trail, her eyes darting to every shadow, every rustling branch. Around midday, she came across an old shelter, a dilapidated structure barely standing against the weight of time. Desperate for a place to rest and collect herself, she stepped inside. The interior was worse than she expected. The walls were covered in graffiti and strange carvings, some of which matched the symbols she'd seen near her tent. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and something else, something metallic, like blood. As she explored the shelter, she found a pile of discarded belongings, old clothes, a rusted camping stove, and a notebook. The notebook was damp and falling apart, but one entry was still legible. Scrawled in shaky handwriting, it read, "They're in the trees. They only come at night. Don't listen to them." The rest of the pages were either waterlogged or torn out. Emily bolted from the shelter, her heart pounding as paranoia consumed her. She ran until her legs gave out, collapsing in a clearing as the sun began to set. As she lay there catching her breath, she heard it again, that faint, childlike giggle. Only this time, it was closer. The last stretch of the hike was a blur. Emily barely remembered the remaining hours, her sole focus on escaping the trail. When she finally reached a ranger station and recounted her ordeal, the ranger's face grew grim. He told her that similar stories had been reported over the years, hikers hearing laughter, finding strange symbols, and feeling watched in that same section of the trail. Some chalked it up to local folklore, while others believed it to be the work of a reclusive cult that had long claimed those woods as their own. Emily never returned to the Appalachian Trail. To this day, she suffers from vivid nightmares of symbols in the dirt, high-pitched laughter, and shadowy figures lurking just out of sight. The Appalachian Trail, for all its natural beauty, remains a place where the boundary between the real and the unreal is perilously thin, and where something inhuman may still be watching from the trees.
Story number 3.
The Appalachian Trail has long been a haven for outdoor enthusiasts seeking tranquility and adventure. But for some, it becomes a labyrinth of terror, where the thin veil between reality and the macabre tears away. One such tale originates from the remote stretch of trail in Pennsylvania, known for its rocky terrain and dense forests. Hikers whisper about the Silent One, a terrifying entity that allegedly stalks those who stray too far from the beaten path. This is the story of Mark and Leah, a couple whose Appalachian journey became their worst nightmare. Mark and Leah were avid hikers and nature lovers who decided to spend a week exploring the Pennsylvania section of the trail in the fall of 2016. They were drawn by the promise of vibrant autumn foliage and crisp mountain air. They planned carefully, bringing maps, supplies, and emergency gear. The trip started uneventfully, with days filled with breathtaking vistas and nights under starlit skies. On the 4th day, they veered off the main trail to explore a lesser-known path that Leah had read about online. It was said to lead to an abandoned fire tower with panoramic views of the valley. As they ventured deeper, the trail grew narrower and the woods darker. The air felt heavy, and an unnatural quiet settled over the area. The usual sounds of nature, chirping birds, rustling leaves, the distant hum of insects, were absent. Leah noticed it first. She stopped abruptly, her face pale. "Do you feel that?" she asked Mark. He nodded. It wasn't just silence, it was the oppressive kind, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. They pressed on, rationalizing the stillness as a quirk of the dense woods. By late afternoon, they reached the fire tower. It stood decrepit and forgotten, its once sturdy beams now rotting and overgrown with moss. As they climbed to the top, the wind picked up, howling through the cracks in the wood. The view was breathtaking, but Leah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. As they descended, the atmosphere grew even more unsettling. Shadows seemed to shift unnaturally among the trees, and faint whispers began to drift through the air. Mark dismissed it as the wind, but Leah wasn't convinced. "It sounds like voices," she said, her voice trembling. Nightfall came quickly. They set up camp in a small clearing near the tower. The silence deepened, broken only by their own movements and the occasional snap of a twig. After dinner, they retreated to their tent. As exhaustion overtook them, they fell asleep, only to be woken hours later by a sound that froze them both in place. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, and slow, they circled their tent. Mark grabbed his flashlight and knife, his heart pounding. He unzipped the tent just enough to shine the light outside, but the beam illuminated only empty woods. The footsteps continued, moving farther away before stopping entirely. The couple huddled together, too frightened to speak. The next morning, they decided to abandon their trip and head back to the main trail. But as they packed up their gear, they found something chilling. Large, human-like footprints surrounding their campsite, each imprint deeper than any an average person could make. Even more disturbing, the prints abruptly ended a few yards away, as if whatever had left them had simply vanished. Their trek back was fraught with unease. The whispers persisted, growing louder as the day wore on. At times, they thought they saw a figure in the distance, a tall, pale silhouette that seemed to dissolve into the trees when they tried to focus on it. The forest felt alive, its branches twisting unnaturally, almost as if reaching for them. By late afternoon, they reached the main trail, but their relief was short-lived. As they paused to rest, Mark noticed something horrifying. The figure was standing just within the tree line, completely still. It was impossibly tall, its face obscured by shadow, yet its presence radiated a suffocating malevolence. And then, without a sound, it began to move toward them. Mark and Leah ran, adrenaline fueling their flight as they navigated the rocky trail. They didn't stop until they reached the nearest road, where a passing driver picked them up and took them to the nearest town. They reported their experience to local authorities, but their story was met with skepticism. No physical evidence was ever found, save for a few blurry photos on Mark's phone showing strange, elongated shadows among the trees. The couple never returned to the Appalachian Trail. They later learned that the area around the fire tower was infamous among locals for strange occurrences, disappearances, sightings of shadowy figures, and the inexplicable sensation of being watched. Some attributed the phenomena to ancient folklore, others to the spirits of those who had perished in the wilderness. To this day, Mark and Leah are haunted by the memory of the Silent One and the oppressive quiet of the forest. Those who hike that section of the Appalachian Trail are often warned, if the woods go silent and the air grows heavy, it's best to turn back. You may not walk out alone, went from there.
Story number 4.
The Appalachian Trail, sprawling across 14 states and countless miles of untamed wilderness, is steeped in legends and dark tales. Among them, one story stands out, a chilling account of a lone hiker named Daniel who disappeared in 2009. What makes his case so disturbing is not just his vanishing, but the terrifying journal he left behind, discovered months later by another hiker. Daniel was an experienced outdoorsman, someone who relished the isolation of the wild. He set out in late October to hike a remote section of the trail in Vermont. He told friends he was looking for peace and inspiration for his writing. But what started as an escape into nature turned into something far more sinister. Daniel's journey began without incident. He kept a detailed journal, jotting down his thoughts and observations about the trail. The entries were mundane at first. Descriptions of the crisp autumn air, the crunch of leaves underfoot, and the golden hues of the forest. But as the days went on, his tone began to change. The first odd entry came on his third night. Saw something strange tonight. A shadow. Too tall for a man, too thin. Thought it might be a tree, but it moved. Probably just my imagination. 2 days later, another entry hinted at unease. Feeling watched. Could be paranoia, but I keep hearing footsteps behind me. They stop when I stop. No one on the trail today, as far as I know. By the 5th day, Daniel's entries took a darker turn. Woke up to find my gear scattered around camp. Nothing missing, just moved. There were footprints around the site. Barefoot, human-like, but wrong. Toes too long, tracks led into the woods, didn't follow them. From that point on, his journal became increasingly erratic. He wrote about hearing whispers at night, faint and unintelligible, as though spoken just beyond the reach of his ears. He described seeing figures in the distance, pale and distorted, that seemed to vanish when he tried to approach. One particularly disturbing entry read, "They don't want me here. I can feel it. The air gets heavier when they're close. Can't explain how I know, but they're always just out of sight, watching, waiting. I thought I saw one last night, crouched by the fire. When I blinked, it was gone." The final entry, written hastily and barely legible, was found days after Daniel's disappearance. "It's not the woods, it's what's in them. They've been here longer than us, longer than anything. They don't speak, but they can make you see, make you hear. Don't trust your eyes, don't trust your mind. If anyone finds this..." The entry ended abruptly, as though he had been interrupted. Daniel was never seen again. Months later, a group of hikers stumbled upon Daniel's abandoned campsite deep in the Vermont wilderness. His tent was shredded, his gear scattered, and his journal lying open near a fire pit that had long gone cold. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, and no body, just the eerie silence of the forest. The hikers reported the discovery to local authorities, who launched a search. Despite weeks of effort, no trace of Daniel was ever found. Search dogs reportedly became agitated and refused to venture into certain parts of the woods. Locals claimed the area had always been strange, with reports of disappearing hikers, strange lights, and a palpable sense of dread dating back decades. Some believe Daniel fell victim to an undiscovered predator, human or otherwise. Others suggest he was driven mad by isolation or something more supernatural. Whatever the truth, his journal remains a haunting reminder of what might lurk in the unexplored corners of the Appalachian Trail. Today, hikers are warned about that stretch of the trail, especially as night falls. Whispers persist of figures moving silently through the trees, shadows that are too tall and too thin, and the unnerving sensation of being watched. Many who venture there claim to feel a presence, as though something ancient and malevolent still roams those woods, waiting for the next hiker to stray too far into its domain.
Story number 5.
The Appalachian Trail has long been a place where nature's beauty meets untamed wilderness, but for some it becomes a descent into darkness. This story comes from the Smoky Mountains section, a misty, remote stretch of trail infamous for strange occurrences. It centers on two friends, Alex and Chris, who in 2018 embarked on a week-long trek that would become a horrifying ordeal neither would forget. The pair were experienced hikers, eager to explore the dense forests and rugged terrain. Their first few days passed without incident, long hikes by day, campfires, and camaraderie by night. On the third day, however, the mood shifted. They had reached a particularly isolated part of the trail, far from any nearby towns or ranger stations. The forest here was dense, the canopy so thick it blocked out much of the sunlight, casting eerie shadows even at noon. That afternoon, as they made their way down a narrow path, Chris spotted something odd in the undergrowth, a small, weathered doll. It was crudely made, with button eyes and straw hair, its face stitched into an unsettling, crooked smile. It seemed out of place, as though someone had deliberately left it there. They joked about it. Blair Witch vibes, Alex laughed, but decided not to touch it. That night, as they set up camp, Alex began to feel uneasy. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The forest was unusually quiet, devoid of the usual nocturnal sounds. Even the crackling of their campfire seemed muted. Chris shrugged it off, blaming fatigue, and they eventually settled into their tent. Sometime in the early hours, Alex woke to a faint noise, a soft, rhythmic tapping. At first, he thought it was rain, but when he listened more closely, he realized it was coming from outside the tent. Tap, tap, tap. It sounded deliberate, almost human, like someone lightly drumming their fingers on a surface. Whispering to Chris, he grabbed a flashlight and unzipped the tent. The beam illuminated nothing but trees and darkness. The tapping stopped. They decided to keep watch in shifts for the remainder of the night, but nothing else happened. By morning, they were eager to leave the area and push forward on the trail. Yet as they packed up their gear, Chris froze, staring at the ground near their tent. There, placed neatly on a log, was the same doll they had seen the day before. Their unease deepened as they moved on. Throughout the day, they both felt an oppressive sense of being followed. Occasionally, they'd catch glimpses of movement in the periphery, something pale and small darting between the trees, but when they turned to look, there was nothing there. By evening, the tension was unbearable. They decided to camp in a more open area, hoping to feel safer. That night, as they sat by the fire, the forest seemed to close in around them. The shadows stretched unnaturally, twisting and shifting in ways that defied logic. Then came the whispers, faint, just beyond the range of comprehension, but unmistakably there. The whispers grew louder, mingling with soft laughter that sent chills down their spines. Suddenly, the fire died, plunging them into darkness. Scrambling for their flashlights, they heard it. The tapping again, this time faster and more insistent, circling their campsite. They shone their lights into the trees, and for a brief moment they saw it, a pale figure, childlike in stature, but with hollow black eyes and impossibly long limbs. It crouched low to the ground, staring at them with an unnatural stillness before disappearing into the shadows. Panic overtook them. Grabbing their essentials, they abandoned their camp and ran blindly down the trail, their flashlights bouncing wildly in the darkness. The tapping and whispers seemed to follow, growing louder as if taunting them. They didn't stop until they reached a shelter at the next trail junction, where they spent the remainder of the night huddled with a group of other hikers. The next morning, Alex and Chris told the other hikers about their experience, but their story was met with skepticism. When they returned to their abandoned campsite later that day to retrieve their remaining gear, they found it undisturbed, except for the doll, which was now sitting inside their tent. Shaken to their core, they cut their trip short and left the trail. Weeks later, Alex did some research and discovered a chilling local legend. Decades earlier, a young girl had gone missing in that same section of the Smoky Mountains. Her body was never found, but hikers occasionally reported seeing a pale, childlike figure in the woods or hearing strange tapping sounds at night. Some believed it was her restless spirit, while others thought something far darker had taken her place. Neither Alex nor Chris ever returned to the Appalachian Trail. The doll, they swore, had followed them home, appearing on Alex's porch one morning before vanishing for good. To this day, both men are haunted by the experience, and by the pale figure that still lingers in their nightmares. Those who hike the Smoky Mountains are often warned, if you find a doll on the trail, leave it alone, and for the love of all that's holy, don't camp nearby.
Story number 6.
The Appalachian Trail is renowned for its raw beauty. but beneath its serene exterior lurk tales of dread and despair. One such story comes from a section in North Carolina where hikers often speak of the Whispering Cabin, a derelict structure hidden deep within the woods. This is the story of Beth, a solo hiker whose encounter with the cabin in 2015 became the stuff of nightmares. Beth was an experienced outdoorswoman who loved the challenge of hiking alone. She had heard rumors about strange occurrences on the trail, but dismissed them as folklore. On her 5th day of a 10-day hike, she came across a barely visible side path that wasn't marked on her map. It was overgrown with gnarled branches forming a natural archway, almost as if inviting or warning her not to enter. Despite her better judgment, Beth's curiosity got the better of her. She followed the path for about an hour until she came upon a clearing. In the center stood an old, crumbling cabin. Its roof sagged under the weight of years, and its wooden walls were splintered and covered in moss. Yet there was something about it that didn't feel entirely abandoned. Beth approached cautiously, calling out to see if anyone was there. Her voice echoed back, unnervingly loud in the silence. She decided to explore inside, reasoning it would make for a unique entry in her hiking journal. The door creaked open with a sound that seemed to stretch unnaturally long. The interior was dark and musty, the air heavy with the scent of decay. Strange markings adorned the walls, symbols carved deeply into the wood, spirals and jagged shapes that made her skin crawl. In the far corner of the single-room cabin was a small pile of objects, old photographs, a child's shoe, and what looked like a melted candle. Among them was a dusty journal. Beth hesitated before picking it up. Its cover was brittle, and many pages were illegible, but one entry caught her eye. "They come at night. They tap on the windows, but there are no windows. They whisper through the walls, but the words aren't for me. I am not alone, but I am. I don't know how much longer I can stay." The entry was dated 1983, over 3 decades earlier. Chills ran down Beth's spine, but she rationalized it as the ramblings of someone who had been isolated too long. She left the journal where she found it and stepped outside, deciding it was time to return to the main trail. As she turned to leave, she heard a soft creaking like floorboards underfoot. The sound came from inside the cabin. Her heart pounded as she realized she hadn't seen or heard anyone approach. Beth froze, debating whether to investigate or run, but the decision was made for her when a faint whisper came from behind her. "Stay!" She bolted, sprinting back down the overgrown path, branches tearing at her clothes and skin. The whispers followed her, growing louder and more frantic. They didn't come from one voice but many, overlapping in an incomprehensible cacophony. She could hear the words "stay," "wait," and "come back" repeated over and over. When Beth finally reached the main trail, the whispers stopped, leaving only the sound of her ragged breathing. She looked back, expecting to see the overgrown path, but it was gone. The forest appeared unbroken, as if the path had never existed. Beth's experience haunted her for years. She later learned that the cabin was infamous among locals. In the early 1900s, it had belonged to a recluse who was rumored to practice dark rituals. Over the years, hikers reported strange occurrences near the site. Disembodied whispers, feelings of dread, and even sightings of shadowy figures near the cabin. Some who stayed overnight there were never seen again. Beth vowed never to hike alone again. To this day, she refuses to talk about the details of what she heard in those whispers, only saying that whatever spoke to her that day wasn't human. The Appalachian Trail holds many secrets, but for those who stumble upon the Whispering Cabin, one lesson becomes clear. Curiosity can lead you down paths from which you may never return.
Story number 7.
The Appalachian Trail, with its vast stretches of untamed wilderness, has a reputation for swallowing people whole. But some who escape its grip return with stories that defy logic. One such story is that of a young man named Eric, whose harrowing experience in 2017 remains one of the most chilling tales whispered among hikers. Eric set out on a solo hike through a secluded portion of the trail in Virginia. He was a seasoned outdoorsman, familiar with the challenges of the wild. His plan was to camp in remote areas far from the bustling shelters frequented by other hikers. He wanted solitude, and for the first few days, he found it. On the 3rd night, Eric set up camp in a clearing surrounded by towering pines. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest came alive with its usual nocturnal sounds: chirping crickets, rustling leaves, the occasional distant howl of a coyote. But as the hours stretched on, the sounds began to fade, replaced by an oppressive silence. Eric brushed it off as his mind playing tricks on him, but an uneasy feeling crept over him. Around midnight, he woke to the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and far too close to his tent. Heart racing, he grabbed his flashlight and knife, then unzipped the tent just enough to peer outside. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing. The footsteps had stopped. He stayed awake the rest of the night, clutching his knife, but nothing else happened. By morning, he convinced himself it had been an animal and decided to press on. The following night, Eric camped near an abandoned hunting shack he had stumbled upon during the day. The shack was in disrepair, with its roof partially caved in and windows shattered, but it provided some comfort against the rising wind. He pitched his tent a few yards away and settled in, exhausted. At some point deep into the night, he woke again. This time it wasn't footsteps that roused him, but the faint sound of humming. It was melodic, almost soothing, but unmistakably human. Eric froze, straining to hear. The humming grew louder, as if whoever or whatever was producing it was circling his tent. Gathering his courage, he burst out of the tent, flashlight in hand, and shouted into the darkness. The humming stopped instantly, leaving only the sound of his own breathing. He scanned the area but found no one. The wind picked up, rustling the trees and sending a chill down his spine. Feeling exposed, Eric retreated to the hunting shack, barricading the door with whatever debris he could find. Inside the shack, the air was damp and cold. The walls were covered in faded, illegible writing, but Eric noticed a single word etched repeatedly into the wood near the door. Mine. He stayed awake, listening intently for any sound, but the night passed uneventfully. When morning came, he packed up quickly and decided to end his trip early. Something about the past 2 nights had shaken him in a way he couldn't explain. As he made his way back toward the main trail, he realized he felt heavier, as if the air itself was pressing down on him. The forest around him seemed darker, the trees more twisted. And then he noticed it. Another set of footprints in the dirt alongside his own. They were barefoot, elongated, and impossibly deep, as if made by something much heavier than a person. They followed his every step. Panic set in, and Eric broke into a run. He didn't stop until he reached the nearest shelter, where a group of other hikers had gathered. Breathless, he told them what had happened, expecting skepticism. Instead, one of the older hikers paled and said, "You were near the Ridge of Shadows, weren't you?" The Ridge of Shadows, the hiker explained, was an area avoided by most locals. Legends spoke of a malevolent presence that clung to the land, luring the curious and the lost. Those who ventured too far often spoke of strange sounds, whispered words, or an unshakable feeling of being watched. Some never came back at all. Eric's encounter didn't end when he left the trail. For weeks after returning home, he felt as though he was being followed. He heard faint humming at night, and on more than one occasion, he found his gear inexplicably moved. He eventually burned everything he had taken on the trip, desperate to sever whatever connection had been formed in those woods. To this day, Eric warns anyone planning to hike the Appalachian Trail, if you hear humming, no matter how far you've come, turn back. Because whatever hums in those woods is not something you want to meet.
Story number 8.
The Appalachian Trail is a place where the lines between natural beauty and unsettling mystery blur. One of the most haunting stories comes from a remote section in Pennsylvania, an area hikers now refer to as Dead Man's Hollow. It's a tale whispered with trembling voices, a grim warning to those who underestimate the eerie power of the wilderness. In 2013, a group of 4 college friends, Jenna, Mark, Alyssa, and Ben, set out to hike a challenging stretch of the trail. They were seasoned hikers, eager for adventure and undeterred by the rugged terrain. Early in their trip, they heard about an old, disused mine shaft off the trail, rumored to be cursed. Locals claimed it was a dead zone where GPS devices failed and compasses spun uselessly. Intrigued, the group decided to find it. They left the marked trail late in the afternoon, following a faint, overgrown path they assumed led to the mine. After an hour of hiking, the forest grew unnaturally quiet. The usual sounds of birds, insects, and rustling leaves faded into a heavy, oppressive silence. Even the wind seemed to die. A sense of unease settled over them, but they pressed on. As dusk fell, they came upon a clearing. At its center was the entrance to the mine, an ominous, gaping hole reinforced with rotting timbers. Above it, nailed to a splintered wooden beam, was a crude sign that read, Keep out. No rest here. Ben joked nervously about ghost stories, but his laughter faltered when Jenna pointed out strange symbols carved into the rocks around the entrance, spirals, crude stick figures, and marks that resembled staring eyes. Against their better judgment, they decided to take a closer look. The mine smelled of damp earth and decay. Their flashlights illuminated jagged walls, rusted tools, and what looked like old tracks for mining carts. The air grew colder the deeper they ventured, and the silence was broken only by their footsteps echoing eerily. About 50 yards in, they found something that stopped them in their tracks. An abandoned campsite. A tattered sleeping bag, empty food cans, and a moldy backpack lay scattered. Scrawled on the wall in what looked like soot or blood was a single word: run. Panic began to set in. They decided to leave immediately, but as they turned to head back, their flashlights flickered and died, plunging them into total darkness. Alyssa screamed, and Mark fumbled with his phone to use its light, but the device wouldn't turn on. Neither would anyone else's. That's when they heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping, like metal striking stone, coming from deeper within the mine. It grew louder, closer. Something was coming. They ran, tripping and stumbling in the dark, following the faint glow of the mine's entrance. As they neared the exit, Ben glanced back and froze, his scream echoing through the tunnel. The others dragged him out into the clearing, where they finally stopped to catch their breath. "What did you see?" Jenna demanded, shaking him. Ben, pale and trembling, could only whisper, "Eyes. So many eyes." The group didn't stop running until they were back on the main trail. They camped in silence that night, huddled together and unable to sleep. The following morning, they reported the abandoned campsite to a ranger. He listened with a grim expression and warned them to stay away from the mine. "You're lucky you got out," he said. "Most people who go there don't." Curiosity got the better of Jenna a few months later, and she did some research. She discovered that the mine had been closed in the early 1900s after a collapse killed 13 miners. Their bodies were never recovered, and locals claimed their spirits lingered, angry and restless. Over the years, hikers who ventured near the mine reported strange lights, disembodied voices, and the overwhelming feeling of being watched. Some disappeared without a trace. Jenna, Mark, Alyssa, and Ben never hiked together again. Ben, in particular, became withdrawn, refusing to talk about what he'd seen. On the rare occasions he did, he described rows of glowing eyes staring at him from the darkness, accompanied by whispers in a language he didn't understand. "They didn't want us there," he would say, his voice hollow. "We should never have gone in." The trail near Dead Man's Hollow remains avoided by most, a place where the whispers of the past mingle with the shadows of the present. Those who dare to approach the mine say the air grows colder, and the faint sound of tapping can still be heard, warning all who listen, "Stay away."